The morning that would shake the British monarchy began like any other at Kensington Palace. Birds chirped in the manicured gardens, security guards maintained their silent vigil, and, inside the grand halls, preparations were underway for what should have been a routine royal engagement. But, by noon that day, Princess Charlotte's world would crumble, her title would vanish, and the most trusted member of the royal guard would walk away from his duty forever. What could drive a decorated officer to abandon his oath to the crown? What secret had been buried so deep within palace walls that its revelation would strip a young princess of everything she had known? The answer lay in a single photograph, a midnight conversation, and a choice that would force everyone involved to question the very foundation of royal tradition. This is the story of betrayal at the highest levels of British society, where loyalty comes with a price too steep for some to pay, and where the truth can be more dangerous than any enemy the monarchy has ever faced. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana had always known her life was different from other children, but she had never questioned why. At 8 years old, she moved through the corridors of Kensington Palace with the natural grace that seemed to run in her bloodline, her small hand often reaching for the reassuring presence of her protection officer, Captain James Morrison. Morrison had been assigned to Charlotte's detail 3 years earlier, shortly after her 5th birthday. Unlike the rotating guards who came and went, he had become a constant in her young life. Where other officers maintained professional distance, Morrison had somehow managed to balance his duty with genuine care for the spirited princess who reminded him so much of his own daughter back home in Scotland. The morning of March 15th started with Charlotte's usual routine. She woke at 7 sharp, brushed her teeth while humming a tune she had learned at school, and dressed in her navy blue uniform with the precision her mother had taught her. The Princess of Wales had always emphasized the importance of presentation, even for everyday activities, and Charlotte took this lesson seriously. Morrison waited outside her bedroom door as always, checking his watch and reviewing the day's schedule on his secure tablet. A visit to a local children's hospital was planned for the afternoon, followed by a private tutoring session back at the palace. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet something felt different about the way the other staff members avoided eye contact with him that morning. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had worked for the royal family for over 20 years, usually greeted Morrison with a warm smile and updates about Charlotte's mood or any concerns from the previous day. Today, she hurried past without a word, her face pale and drawn. Even Thomas, the junior footman who normally couldn't resist sharing palace gossip, kept his head down when their paths crossed in the main hallway. Charlotte bounced down the grand staircase, her patent leather shoes clicking against the marble steps in a rhythm that had become music to Morrison's ears over the years. She carried her favorite stuffed elephant, a gift from her great-grandmother that she refused to travel without, despite being told repeatedly that it wasn't appropriate for public engagements. "Captain Morrison, did you know that elephants can remember things for their whole lives?" Charlotte asked, as she often did when she learned something new at school. Her curiosity about the world never failed to amaze him, and he found himself looking forward to these conversations more than he probably should have. "Is that so, Your Royal Highness?" "That's quite remarkable," Morrison replied, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the breakfast room. He had long ago stopped trying to discourage her endless questions, finding instead that they provided a window into her brilliant young mind. The Princess of Wales was already seated at the breakfast table, reviewing correspondence while sipping her morning tea. She looked up as Charlotte entered, her expression brightening despite the obvious tension around her eyes. Morrison had learned to read these subtle signs over the years, understanding that even royalty struggled with the pressures of their position. "Good morning, darling. Did you sleep well?" the princess asked, setting aside her papers to focus entirely on her daughter. This complete attention was something Morrison had always admired about Charlotte's mother. No matter what crisis might be brewing in the background, Charlotte always came first. Charlotte climbed into her chair and immediately began chattering about her dreams from the night before, something involving flying horses and castles made of ice cream. Morrison took his position near the window, close enough to respond to any threat, but far enough away to give the family privacy. This delicate balance had taken months to perfect when he first joined the detail. As Charlotte ate her breakfast, Morrison noticed a series of hushed phone calls that kept pulling the Princess of Wales away from the table. Each time she returned, her smile seemed a little more forced, her responses to Charlotte's stories a little more distracted. Something was definitely wrong, but Morrison had learned not to pry into royal family business unless it directly affected security. The drive to the children's hospital should have been routine. Morrison sat in the front passenger seat of the armored vehicle while Charlotte and her mother rode in the back, discussing the gifts they would be giving to the young patients. Charlotte had insisted on bringing books from her own collection, carefully selecting stories she thought other children would enjoy. But, as they pulled up to the hospital, Morrison noticed something that made his blood run cold. Photographers and reporters had gathered in numbers far exceeding what had been expected for a simple hospital visit. Camera flashes began popping before they had even stopped moving, and the crowd pressed against the security barriers with an intensity that spoke of a major story breaking. Morrison's radio crackled to life with urgent communications from the advanced security team. Words like situation developing and immediate reassessment required filled the airwaves. He turned to look at the Princess of Wales, whose face had gone completely white as she stared out at the crowd of media. "Mummy, why are there so many people?" Charlotte asked, pressing her face against the tinted window with the innocent curiosity that had no understanding of the storm that was about to break around her. The Princess of Wales reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently while her eyes met Morrison's in the rearview mirror. In that moment, he saw something that would haunt him for years to come. The look of a mother who knew her child's world was about to change forever, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Morrison made the decision that would later be cited as the first crack in his unwavering loyalty to the crown. Instead of following protocol and proceeding with the planned engagement, he instructed the driver to return to Kensington Palace immediately. The safety of his principal came before any public relations considerations, and the media frenzy suggested that safety was now a serious concern. The journey back to the palace was conducted in tense silence, broken only by Charlotte's occasional questions about why they weren't going to see the sick children as planned. Her mother deflected each inquiry with gentle responses about changes in schedule, but Morrison could see the strain beginning to show. Upon their return to Kensington Palace, Morrison was immediately summoned to a meeting with Sir Edward Whitmore, the private secretary to the Prince and Princess of Wales. The elderly man's office felt more like a courtroom as Morrison entered, finding not only Sir Edward but also representatives from the Palace Security Office and the Metropolitan Police Protection Unit. "Captain Morrison, please take a seat," Sir Edward said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. The man who had always treated Morrison with respect and appreciation now looked at him as if he were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. Morrison remained standing, his military training taking over in situations of uncertainty. "Sir, if this is about the decision to return early from the hospital visit, I take full responsibility. The media presence posed a potential security risk that—" Sir Edward held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't about the hospital visit, Captain. This is about a much more serious matter that has come to light. We need to discuss your future with Princess Charlotte's protection detail." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. For 3 years, he had dedicated his life to keeping Charlotte safe, building a relationship of trust that went beyond professional duty. The idea of being removed from her detail felt like losing a family member. "I don't understand, sir. Has there been a complaint about my service? Have I failed in some aspect of my duties?" Morrison asked, his voice remaining steady despite the turmoil building inside him. Sir Edward exchanged glances with the other men in the room before opening a file folder on his desk. The action seemed ominous, as if whatever was inside that folder contained the power to destroy everything Morrison had worked for. "Captain, we need to ask you some questions about your background, specifically regarding your family history and any connections you might have that could pose a conflict of interest," Sir Edward continued, his tone becoming increasingly formal and cold. Morrison's mind raced through possibilities, trying to understand what could have triggered this sudden scrutiny. His background checks had been thorough when he joined the protection unit. His service record was exemplary, and his personal life was an open book. There was nothing in his past that should cause concern. "Sir, I've served with distinction for 15 years, the last 3 with Princess Charlotte. My loyalty to the crown and to her safety has never wavered. I would appreciate knowing what specific concerns have been raised," Morrison said, allowing a hint of his growing frustration to color his words. The Metropolitan Police representative leaned forward, placing a photograph on the desk where Morrison could see it. The image showed a woman Morrison recognized immediately, his grandmother, photographed sometime in the 1940s. She was young and beautiful, wearing what appeared to be an evening gown from that era. "Captain Morrison, can you tell us about this woman?" the officer asked, tapping the photograph with his finger. Morrison stared at the image, confusion replacing his earlier anger. His grandmother had died when he was 12 years old, taking with her most of the stories about her youth during World War II. She had always been reluctant to discuss those years, deflecting questions with jokes or changing the subject entirely. "That's my grandmother, Margaret Morrison, maiden name Margaret Sinclair. She died in 1998. I'm not sure what relevance she has to my current position or any security concerns," Morrison replied, genuine puzzlement evident in his voice. Sir Edward pulled out additional photographs, documents that appeared to be decades old, and what looked like official correspondence bearing royal crests. The items were spread across the desk like pieces of a puzzle that Morrison couldn't begin to understand. "Captain Morrison, new information has come to light regarding your grandmother's relationship with the royal family during the 1940s. Information that, if accurate, would create a significant conflict of interest regarding your current assignment," Sir Edward explained, his voice softening slightly with what might have been sympathy. Morrison felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he stared at the documents. Whatever secrets his grandmother had kept, whatever connections she might have had to the royal family, were apparently significant enough to threaten his career and his relationship with Charlotte. As the meeting continued, pieces of a story began to emerge that would change everything Morrison thought he knew about his family, about his position, and about the little princess he had sworn to protect. The truth, when it finally came to light, would prove more devastating than anyone in that room could have imagined. Outside the office windows, Charlotte was playing in the palace gardens, unaware that the man she trusted most in the world was fighting for the right to remain by her side. Soon, she would learn that even in a world built on tradition and continuity, nothing was ever truly permanent, and the people she loved most could be taken away without warning or explanation. The documents spread across Sir Edward's desk told a story that Morrison could never have imagined. His grandmother, Margaret Sinclair, had not simply lived through World War II as he had always believed. According to the papers before him, she had been intimately connected to the royal family during one of the most turbulent periods in British history. "Your grandmother worked as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Elizabeth during 1947 and 1948, Sir Edward explained, pointing to employment records that bore the official seal of Buckingham Palace. She was present during some of the most significant moments of the future Queen's early married life." Morrison studied the documents with growing amazement. Photographs showed a young woman who was unmistakably his grandmother standing beside the future Queen Elizabeth II at various court functions. In one image, she was clearly visible in the background during Princess Elizabeth's wedding preparations. In another, she stood among a small group of attendants during what appeared to be a private family gathering. But why was this never mentioned in my security clearance? Surely a family connection to the royal household would have been discovered during the vetting process, Morrison asked, trying to understand how such significant information could have remained hidden. The Metropolitan Police representative cleared his throat before responding. "Captain Morrison, your grandmother's employment was terminated abruptly in December 1948. The official records were sealed, and her name was removed from most palace documentation. It's only recently that these files have been reviewed as part of a routine historical audit." Sir Edward picked up another document, this one bearing what appeared to be King George VI's personal seal. Margaret Sinclair was dismissed from royal service under circumstances that were considered sensitive at the time. The specifics were classified to protect the monarchy during a period when any scandal could have had serious consequences for the crown. Morrison felt a growing sense of unease as he processed this information. His grandmother had always been vague about her work during the late 1940s, claiming she had been employed in various domestic positions around London. The idea that she had been hiding such a significant connection to the royal family raised questions about everything else she might have concealed. What exactly did she do to warrant dismissal? Morrison asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sir Edward and the police representative exchanged another meaningful look before Sir Edward opened what appeared to be a classified file. The red covering and multiple security stamps indicated that the contents were of the highest sensitivity level. Margaret Sinclair was discovered to be pregnant in late 1948. The father was identified as a member of the royal household, though his exact identity was never officially recorded. To avoid scandal, she was quietly dismissed and provided with a financial settlement on the condition that she never discuss her employment or the circumstances of her departure, Sir Edward read from the file. The words hit Morrison like a thunderbolt. His grandfather had supposedly died in the war, leaving his grandmother to raise Morrison's father as a single mother. This had been the family story for as long as he could remember, a tale of wartime tragedy and maternal strength that had shaped his understanding of his family history. "You're suggesting that my grandfather wasn't actually my grandfather," Morrison said slowly, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. "And that my father was the result of a relationship between my grandmother and someone connected to the royal family." "The documentation strongly suggests that possibility," Sir Edward confirmed. "The timing aligns with your father's birth in 1949, and the financial records show regular payments made to your grandmother well into the 1960s, ostensibly to ensure her continued discretion." Morrison thought about his father, William Morrison, who had died in a car accident when Morrison was just 18 years old. He had been a quiet man who rarely spoke about his childhood or his mother's past. Morrison had always attributed this reticence to the typical reserved nature of his Scottish heritage, never imagining it might stem from family secrets of such magnitude. "If this is true, what does it mean for my position with Princess Charlotte?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The police representative leaned forward again. "Captain Morrison, if your father was indeed the illegitimate son of a royal family member, that would make you a distant cousin to Princess Charlotte. While the relationship would be unofficial and unrecognized, it creates a potential conflict of interest that cannot be ignored." Sir Edward added, "The palace has always maintained strict policies about family connections within the protection services. Even distant relationships must be disclosed and carefully considered to avoid any appearance of impropriety or divided loyalties." Morrison felt the world tilting around him as he struggled to understand how his entire life had been built on a foundation of half-truths and concealed histories. The grandmother he had adored, the woman who had taught him about honor and duty, had been keeping secrets that now threatened to destroy the career he loved. "There's more," Sir Edward continued, retrieving another set of documents from the file. "Recent genealogical research has uncovered additional information that makes this situation even more complex." Morrison waited, hardly daring to breathe as Sir Edward prepared to deliver what was clearly going to be another devastating revelation. "The financial settlement your grandmother received wasn't just for her discretion. It was also to ensure that any children from her relationship would never pursue claims against the crown or seek recognition of their royal heritage. Your father signed a similar agreement when he came of age, renouncing any potential claims in exchange for continued financial support." The scope of the deception was staggering. Morrison realized that his entire family had been living under agreements that bound them to silence, while accepting what amounted to hush money from the royal family. His father's modest but comfortable lifestyle, his ability to afford quality education for Morrison despite working in a relatively low-paying government position, suddenly made sense. "How long have you known about this?" Morrison asked, anger beginning to replace his initial shock. "Was my assignment to Princess Charlotte's detail planned because of this connection, or was it genuinely based on my qualifications?" Sir Edward hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told Morrison everything he needed to know. His selection for Charlotte's protection detail hadn't been the professional recognition he had believed it to be. It had been orchestrated by people who knew about his family's hidden history. "Your qualifications were absolutely genuine, Captain Morrison. However, there were those within the palace hierarchy who believed that someone with your particular background might have additional motivation to ensure Princess Charlotte's safety," Sir Edward admitted. Morrison felt sick as the full implications became clear. He had been chosen not despite his family connection, but because of it. The trust he thought he had earned through years of exemplary service had been built on a lie, and his relationship with Charlotte had been manipulated from the beginning. "And now?" Morrison asked. "What happens now that this information has come to light?" "The situation has become untenable," the police representative explained. "Recent media investigations into royal protection arrangements have uncovered some of these historical documents. There are journalists actively pursuing the story of your family's connection to the crown. If this information becomes public while you're still assigned to Princess Charlotte's detail, it could create a scandal that would damage both your reputation and hers." Morrison understood the politics involved, but the thought of leaving Charlotte's side felt like abandoning a child who had come to depend on him. Over the past 3 years, he had been more than just her bodyguard. He had been a constant presence in her life, someone she could rely on when the pressures of royal life became overwhelming. "Does Princess Charlotte know any of this?" Morrison asked, dreading the answer. "No, and it's imperative that she never learns the truth about your family connection," Sir Edward said firmly. "Her Royal Highness is too young to understand the complexities involved, and any knowledge of this situation could create confusion about her own position and heritage." Morrison realized that he was being asked to disappear from Charlotte's life without explanation, leaving her to wonder why someone she trusted had suddenly abandoned her. The thought was almost unbearable, but he also understood that staying might expose her to media scrutiny that could be far more damaging. "There's one final matter we need to discuss," Sir Edward said, opening another file. "The palace has prepared a comprehensive settlement offer that would ensure your financial security in exchange for your immediate resignation and continued discretion about these matters." Morrison looked at the monetary figure on the paper and felt even more disgusted. Once again, the royal family was using money to buy silence and compliance. The pattern established with his grandmother was being repeated with him, perpetuating a cycle of secrets and financial dependence that had already destroyed too many lives. "I need time to consider this," Morrison said, standing up from his chair. "I won't make any hasty decisions about something that affects not only my future, but also Princess Charlotte's well-being." Sir Edward nodded, though his expression suggested that time was not a luxury they could afford. "Captain Morrison, I understand this is overwhelming. However, the media pressure is intensifying, and we may need to make an announcement about changes to Princess Charlotte's protection detail within the next few days." As Morrison left the meeting, his mind was reeling with questions and contradictions. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his career, and his relationship with Charlotte was now suspect. The secrets that had been buried for over 70 years had finally surfaced, threatening to destroy not only his life, but potentially damaging a young princess who had never asked to be born into such a complicated world. Walking through the palace corridors that had become as familiar as his own home, Morrison realized that his time at Kensington Palace was coming to an end. The only question remaining was whether he would leave quietly, accepting the palace's terms, or fight for the right to remain in Charlotte's life regardless of the consequences. In the distance, he could hear Charlotte's laughter echoing from the garden where she played with her governess, blissfully unaware that the most important constant in her young life was about to be taken away from her. The sound of her happiness made Morrison's heart ache. Knowing that his decision would likely rob her of that innocent joy forever, Morrison spent the next 2 days in a state of emotional turmoil that he struggled to hide from Charlotte and the rest of the palace staff. Every interaction with the young princess felt like it might be their last, and he found himself memorizing small details about her that he had previously taken for granted. The way she hummed while doing her homework, her habit of talking to her stuffed elephant when she thought no one was listening, and the absolute trust in her eyes when she looked at him. The weight of his family's secrets pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had always prided himself on his honesty and integrity, values that had been instilled in him by the very grandmother whose lies had created this impossible situation. The irony was not lost on him that Margaret Sinclair had taught him about honor while concealing a truth that would eventually threaten everything he held dear. On the second night after his meeting with Sir Edward, Morrison made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He drove to his childhood home in Edinburgh, now occupied by his Aunt Sarah, his father's sister who had helped raise him after his parents' deaths. If anyone knew the truth about his family's hidden history, it would be Sarah Morrison. His aunt's small cottage in the Morningside district looked exactly as it had during his youth, with its neat garden and lace curtains that spoke of a woman who took pride in maintaining traditional standards. Sarah had never married, dedicating her life to caring for family members and working as a secretary for a local law firm. Morrison had always admired her practical nature and straightforward approach to life's challenges. Sarah opened the door with obvious surprise at seeing her nephew on her doorstep so late in the evening. At 68 years old, she remained sharp and energetic, though Morrison noticed new lines around her eyes that spoke of recent worry or stress. "Jamie, what brings you here at this hour? Is everything all right with your work?" she asked, using the childhood nickname that only she still employed. Morrison followed her into the sitting room that remained virtually unchanged from his youth. The same floral wallpaper covered the walls, and his grandmother's photographs still held places of honor on the mantelpiece. Looking at those familiar images now, Morrison wondered how much of what he thought he knew about Margaret Sinclair was actually true. "Aunt Sarah, I need to ask you about grandmother's time during the war, specifically about her work and about my father's parentage," Morrison said, deciding that directness was the only approach that would work. Sarah's face went completely white, and she sank into her favorite armchair as if her legs could no longer support her. The reaction confirmed Morrison's worst fears. His aunt had known about the family secrets all along. "Oh, Jamie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I had hoped this would never come to light. Your grandmother made me promise on her deathbed that these secrets would die with her generation. Morrison sat on the sofa across from his aunt, leaning forward with an intensity that made his emotional investment in the truth obvious. The palace has discovered everything, Aunt Sarah. They know about grandmother's employment, about the circumstances of her dismissal, and about the financial arrangements that continued for decades. My position with Princess Charlotte is in jeopardy because of information I never knew existed. Sarah covered her face with her hands, and Morrison could see her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her cheeks. Your grandmother was the most wonderful woman I've ever known, but she carried a burden that nearly destroyed her, Sarah began, her voice gaining strength as she prepared to finally tell the truth. She loved Princess Elizabeth like a sister, and she was devoted to her service in a way that went beyond mere employment. Morrison waited patiently as his aunt gathered her thoughts, understanding that this confession was probably decades overdue. Margaret met Prince Philip's equerry, Lieutenant Commander Harold Pemberton, during one of the royal couple's private gatherings in 1947. He was a war hero, charming and handsome, and he swept your grandmother off her feet in a way that was both wonderful and terrible, Sarah continued. Morrison felt his heart sink as he realized that his mysterious grandfather had been a member of Prince Philip's staff, making the royal connection even closer than he had feared. Harold was married, but he told Margaret that his marriage was over, that he was planning to seek a divorce as soon as it became socially acceptable. She believed him because she loved him desperately, and because she was young and naive about the ways of the world, Sarah explained, her voice growing bitter with old anger. What happened to him? Morrison asked, though he suspected the answer would not be pleasant. Harold Pemberton had no intention of leaving his wife. When Margaret told him she was pregnant, he panicked and reported their relationship to his superiors as an attempt by Margaret to compromise his position. He painted her as a scheming woman who had seduced him to gain access to royal secrets, Sarah said, her voice rising with indignation that had apparently festered for over 70 years. Morrison felt sick as he contemplated the betrayal his grandmother had endured. Not only had she been abandoned by the man she loved, but he had actively participated in destroying her reputation to protect his own career. The palace investigation was swift and brutal, Sarah continued. Margaret was accused of inappropriate conduct and dismissed without references. The only mercy shown was a financial settlement that ensured her silence and provided basic support for her unborn child. Morrison thought about his father, William, and wondered how much he had known about his true parentage. The quiet sadness that had always surrounded the man suddenly made perfect sense. Did my father know the truth? Morrison asked. Sarah nodded slowly. William learned the truth when he turned 18 and was required to sign the continuation of the financial agreement. The revelation devastated him, Jamie. He had grown up believing his father was a war hero who had died fighting for his country. Learning that he was actually the illegitimate son of a man who had betrayed his mother broke something inside him. Morrison remembered his father's reluctance to discuss family history and his apparent discomfort with anything related to the royal family. William Morrison had always changed the television channel when royal events were broadcast, and he had seemed genuinely surprised when his son expressed interest in a career that might bring him into contact with the monarchy. The worst part, Sarah continued, was that Harold Pemberton went on to have a distinguished career. He received honors and recognition for his service, while your grandmother lived in exile from the world she had loved. She never spoke ill of Princess Elizabeth, though. She understood that the future queen had no choice but to distance herself from the scandal. Morrison sat in stunned silence as he processed the full scope of his family's tragic history. His grandmother had been victimized by a system that protected powerful men while destroying the women who trusted them. His father had lived with the shame of circumstances beyond his control. And now Morrison himself was being forced to pay for sins committed before he was even born. There's something else, Jamie, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Your grandmother kept a diary during her time at the palace. She wrote down everything that happened, including details about royal family life that were never meant to become public knowledge. Morrison felt a new wave of panic as he realized the implications of this revelation. Where is this diary now? It's hidden in the cottage, in a place where I thought it would never be discovered. But if the palace is conducting a thorough investigation into your grandmother's time there, they may eventually demand access to all her personal effects, Sarah explained. Morrison understood that the diary represented both a potential goldmine for media outlets and a weapon that could be used to destroy the royal family's carefully maintained privacy. In the wrong hands, it could expose intimate details about the early years of Queen Elizabeth's marriage and provide ammunition for Republicans who sought to undermine the monarchy. "I need to see it," Morrison said, knowing that his decision about whether to accept the palace's settlement offer would depend on understanding exactly what secrets his family had been guarding. Sarah led him to her bedroom and moved aside a heavy wardrobe to reveal a loose floorboard. From the hidden space beneath, she withdrew a leather-bound journal that looked remarkably well-preserved despite its age. Morrison opened the diary and immediately recognized his grandmother's neat handwriting. The entries were dated from September 1947 through November 1948, covering the entire period of her employment and her relationship with Harold Pemberton. As he read selected passages, Morrison began to understand why the palace had been so desperate to keep his grandmother's story secret. She had been present during intimate family moments, privy to conversations about the future of the monarchy, and witness to personal struggles that the royal family had never intended to make public. More damaging still were her detailed accounts of Harold Pemberton's behavior and the palace's handling of her dismissal. The diary painted a picture of institutional cruelty and systematic cover-up that would be devastating if it ever became public knowledge. "Jamie, what are you going to do?" Sarah asked as he closed the diary and returned it to its hiding place. Morrison looked at his aunt, this woman who had helped raise him and who had carried these family secrets for so many years. He thought about Charlotte, probably asleep in her bed at Kensington Palace, trusting that he would be there to protect her tomorrow and every day after that. "I don't know, Aunt Sarah," he admitted. "But I think I'm about to make a decision that will change everything, not just for me, but for people I care about more than my own future." As he drove back to London through the dark Scottish countryside, Morrison carried with him not only the weight of his family's secrets, but also the knowledge that he now possessed information that could either destroy or protect the institution he had sworn to serve. The choice he made in the coming days would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. The dashboard clock showed 3 in the morning as Morrison pulled into the staff parking area at Kensington Palace. In a few hours, Charlotte would wake up expecting to see him at breakfast, ready to start another day under his protection. He wondered if he would have the strength to look into her trusting eyes while knowing that their time together was rapidly coming to an end. The morning after Morrison's revelation-filled trip to Scotland dawned gray and drizzly, matching his somber mood as he prepared for what might be his final day as Princess Charlotte's protection officer. He had slept poorly, his dreams filled with images of his grandmother as a young woman, betrayed and alone, carrying secrets that would haunt 3 generations of his family. As he dressed in his crisp uniform and checked his equipment with the same meticulous care he had maintained for years, Morrison made a decision that surprised even himself. He would tell Charlotte the truth about his departure, not about the family connections or palace politics, but about the fact that sometimes good people had to make difficult choices for the greater good. Charlotte was already in the breakfast room when Morrison arrived, chattering excitedly to her mother about a school project on medieval castles. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Morrison found himself smiling genuinely for the first time in days as he listened to her detailed plans for building a model fortress. "Captain Morrison, did you know that castle walls were sometimes 20 feet thick?" Charlotte asked, turning to him with the bright curiosity that never failed to warm his heart. "That's quite impressive, Your Royal Highness. Those builders certainly knew how to create strong defenses," Morrison replied, struck by the irony that he was about to demolish the defensive walls of trust that had protected Charlotte's sense of security. The Princess of Wales looked up from her correspondence, and Morrison caught a flash of something in her eyes that suggested she knew about the palace investigation. As Charlotte's mother, she would have been briefed about any changes to her daughter's protection detail, and she was clearly struggling with how to handle the situation. After breakfast, Morrison accompanied Charlotte to her morning tutoring session, walking through the palace corridors that had become as familiar as his own home. He found himself noticing details he had previously overlooked, the way sunlight streamed through the tall windows, the sound of Charlotte's footsteps echoing on the polished floors, the comfortable silence that existed between them when words weren't necessary. During Charlotte's lesson, Morrison received a text message that made his blood run cold. A tabloid journalist had contacted the palace press office with specific questions about his family history and his assignment to Princess Charlotte's detail. The media investigation that Sir Edward had warned about was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Morrison stepped outside the tutoring room to make a secure phone call to Sir Edward's office. The conversation was brief and devastating. The journalist had somehow obtained copies of the financial records showing payments to Morrison's grandmother, and was threatening to publish a story about royal cover-ups and hidden family connections unless the palace provided an official comment. "Captain Morrison, we need you to submit your resignation immediately." Sir Edward's voice was tense with barely controlled panic. "The story is scheduled to run in tomorrow's edition unless we can demonstrate that appropriate action has already been taken." Morrison felt the walls closing in around him as he realized that his time with Charlotte was about to end not gradually, as he had hoped, but immediately and without proper explanation. The thought of disappearing from her life without warning was almost unbearable. "Sir Edward, I need 1 hour alone with Princess Charlotte to explain my departure appropriately. She deserves better than having me simply vanish from her life," Morrison said, knowing he was asking for a concession that went against standard protocol. There was a long pause before Sir Edward responded. "Captain Morrison, you understand that you cannot reveal any details about the investigation or your family history. Princess Charlotte must believe that your departure is a routine reassignment." Morrison agreed to the terms, though he had already decided that he would find a way to give Charlotte a more honest explanation than the official story would allow. She was an intelligent child who would see through obvious deceptions, and he respected her too much to insult her intelligence with a transparent lie. When Charlotte's tutoring session ended, Morrison suggested they take a walk in the palace gardens, claiming he wanted to check the security perimeter. It was a routine they had established over the years, combining his professional responsibilities with Charlotte's need for fresh air and exercise. The gardens were particularly beautiful that morning, with spring flowers beginning to bloom despite the overcast sky. Charlotte skipped ahead of Morrison along the gravel paths, stopping occasionally to examine interesting insects or flowers. Her joy in simple discoveries reminded Morrison of everything he would miss about being part of her daily life. They settled on a bench near the rose garden, the same spot where Morrison had often brought Charlotte when she needed a quiet moment away from the pressures of royal life. The privacy screens installed around the area ensured they could speak freely without concern about being overheard or photographed. "Princess Charlotte, I need to tell you something important," Morrison began, his voice carefully controlled to hide the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Charlotte looked up at him with immediate concern, her intuitive nature picking up on the seriousness of his tone. "Are you feeling sick, Captain Morrison? You've seemed different the past few days." Morrison marveled at her perceptiveness, reminded once again of how much more aware royal children became of adult emotions than their peers. Living constantly under scrutiny had taught Charlotte to read subtle cues that other 8-year-olds might miss entirely. "I'm not sick, but I do have news that might make you sad," Morrison continued. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about their work, decisions that affect people they care about very much." Charlotte's expression grew increasingly worried as she processed his words. "Are you going away?" Morrison felt his heart breaking as he saw the fear beginning to cloud her bright eyes. In that moment, he understood exactly what his grandmother must have felt when she realized her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her own life. "Yes, I am. My work with you as your protection officer is coming to an end, and I'll be moving to a different assignment," Morrison said, choosing his words carefully to provide truth without revealing the complex circumstances behind his departure. Charlotte was quiet for several minutes, staring down at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her cheeks, and Morrison had to fight every instinct that told him to comfort her as he would his own daughter. "Is it because I did something wrong? Did I make you not want to protect me anymore?" Charlotte asked, her voice small and broken in a way that nearly destroyed Morrison's resolve to maintain professional composure. "No, sweetheart," Morrison said, abandoning protocol to use the endearment that felt natural. "You have been the most wonderful part of my job. You're intelligent, kind, curious, and brave. Any protection officer would be honored to work with you." Charlotte wiped her nose on her sleeve, a very unroyal gesture that reminded Morrison of her essential humanity beneath all the titles and expectations. "Then, why do you have to go?" Morrison struggled to find words that would be both honest and appropriate for a child her age. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems that they created a long time ago, before you were even born. These problems can make it difficult for them to continue doing jobs they love, even when they've done nothing wrong themselves. Charlotte considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Like how great Aunt Margaret had to stop being a dancer because of the war, even though she loved dancing. Morrison was struck by her analogy, which captured the essence of his situation more accurately than she could possibly know. Yes, very much like that. Sometimes circumstances beyond our control force us to give up things that are important to us. Will I ever see you again? Charlotte asked, the question Morrison had been dreading most. I don't know, Morrison admitted, unable to lie to her even though a comforting falsehood might have been kinder. But I want you to know that protecting you and getting to know you has been the most important work of my life. I'll always remember our conversations about elephants and castles and all the amazing things you've taught me. Charlotte suddenly threw her arms around Morrison in a fierce hug that violated every rule about appropriate physical contact between protection officers and their principals. Morrison returned the embrace, knowing that this moment of genuine affection was worth whatever disciplinary action might result. I love you, Captain Morrison, Charlotte whispered against his shoulder. I wish you could stay with me forever. Morrison felt tears threatening his own composure as he held this remarkable child who had given him purpose and joy for 3 years. I love you too, Princess Charlotte. Remember that no matter where I am or what I'm doing, I'll always be proud of the incredible young woman you're going to become. As they walked back toward the palace, Morrison's secure phone buzzed with an urgent message from Sir Edward. The tabloid had moved up their publication deadline, and the story about royal cover-ups was now scheduled to run that evening on their website. Morrison's resignation needed to be submitted within the next 2 hours to have any hope of containing the scandal. Inside the palace, Morrison began the process of officially ending his service to Princess Charlotte. He submitted his written resignation, turned in his royal protection credentials, and completed the security debriefing that would ensure his continued discretion about palace procedures. The hardest part was watching Charlotte try to maintain her composure as other staff members began treating Morrison like a visitor rather than a trusted colleague. The transition was subtle but unmistakable, and Morrison could see that Charlotte was beginning to understand the finality of his departure. As afternoon turned to evening, Morrison completed his final security check of Charlotte's quarters and prepared to leave Kensington Palace for the last time as her protection officer. He paused in the doorway of her playroom, where she was quietly working on homework with her governess, and committed the scene to memory. Charlotte looked up and caught him watching her. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, and Morrison saw in her gaze a maturity that hadn't been there that morning. She raised her small hand in a subtle wave, and Morrison nodded once in acknowledgement before turning away. Walking toward the staff exit, Morrison encountered the Princess of Wales in the main corridor. She approached him with obvious emotion, extending her hand in a formal gesture that somehow managed to convey genuine gratitude and regret. Captain Morrison, thank you for your dedicated service to our family. Charlotte is a better person for having known you, and she'll carry the lessons you've taught her for the rest of her life, she said, her voice carefully controlled but warm with sincerity. Morrison shook her hand and bowed slightly, recognizing that this was likely the last conversation he would ever have with any member of the royal family he had served. It has been my honor, Your Royal Highness. Princess Charlotte is an extraordinary young woman who will make her family and her country proud. As Morrison drove away from Kensington Palace that evening, he carried with him the knowledge that his decision to leave quietly had protected Charlotte from a media scandal that could have overshadowed her childhood. The tabloid story would run as planned, but it would focus on his mysterious departure rather than exposing the family secrets that had made his position untenable. The sacrifice felt enormous, but Morrison knew he had made the only choice that truly put Charlotte's interests above his own. Sometimes love meant walking away, even when staying was what your heart desired most. 6 months after Morrison's departure from Kensington Palace, the full consequences of the royal scandal that had been carefully contained began to ripple outward in ways that no one could have predicted. The tabloid story about his mysterious resignation had sparked a media frenzy that eventually uncovered far more than anyone had wanted revealed about the monarchy's hidden histories. Morrison had retreated to a small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, far from the London media circus that had consumed his former life. He worked as a security consultant for rural estates, a job that paid well enough to maintain his independence while keeping him far from the royal spotlight. The irony that he now protected country houses and their wealthy owners was not lost on him, but the work provided solitude and purpose without the emotional complications of his previous position. The cottage had belonged to his Aunt Sarah, who had passed away suddenly, just 2 months after Morrison's resignation. Her death had been peaceful, occurring in her sleep, but Morrison couldn't help wondering if the stress of finally revealing the family secrets had contributed to her decline. In her will, she had left him not only the cottage but also his grandmother's diary, along with a letter explaining that the truth belonged to him now to protect or reveal as he saw fit. Morrison had read the diary cover to cover multiple times, each reading revealing new details about his grandmother's relationship with the royal family and the systematic way she had been erased from palace history. Margaret Sinclair emerged from the pages as a complex woman who had loved deeply, been betrayed completely, and spent the rest of her life protecting secrets that weren't entirely her own to keep. The most devastating entries described the weeks following her dismissal, when she had received no word from Harold Pemberton and slowly realized that his promises of love and eventual marriage had been lies designed to exploit her position within the royal household. Her pain was raw on the pages, mixed with anger at her own naivety and determination to protect her unborn child from the scandal that had destroyed her own reputation. But it was the later entries, written during her final weeks of employment, that contained the information Morrison knew could shake the monarchy to its foundations. Margaret had been present during private conversations between Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip during the early months of their marriage, witnessing moments of doubt, disagreement, and vulnerability that had never been intended for outside observation. More significantly, she had documented financial irregularities and personal behaviors among palace staff that suggested corruption and abuse of power at the highest levels of the royal household. Harold Pemberton had not been the only married man exploiting young women in royal service, and Margaret's diary contained names, dates, and specific incidents that painted a picture of institutional dysfunction that had been carefully hidden from public scrutiny. Morrison understood why the palace had been so desperate to keep his family history secret. The diary didn't just threaten to expose his grandmother's personal story, it threatened to reveal decades of systematic abuse and cover-up that could destroy public faith in the monarchy itself. As winter settled over the Highlands, Morrison received an unexpected visitor. A sleek black car wound its way up the narrow road to his cottage, clearly out of place in the rugged landscape. From his kitchen window, Morrison watched as Sir Edward Whitmore emerged from the passenger seat, looking older and more careworn than during their last meeting at the palace. Morrison met his former superior at the front door, unsurprised by this visit but curious about its timing. He had expected some form of contact eventually, given the ongoing media interest in his story and the palace's need to ensure his continued discretion. "Sir Edward, you're a long way from London," Morrison said, stepping aside to allow the older man into his modest home. "Captain Morrison, thank you for agreeing to see me. I hope you understand that this visit is both official and personal," Sir Edward replied, accepting Morrison's offer of tea with visible relief after the long journey. They sat in Morrison's small sitting room, where a fire crackled in the stone hearth and books about Scottish history lined wooden shelves. The contrast with the formal palace offices where they had last met could not have been more stark. "I assume this has to do with Princess Charlotte's recent announcement," Morrison said, referring to news that had broken just 3 days earlier about the young princess's decision to renounce her royal titles and withdraw from public life. Sir Edward nodded gravely. "Princess Charlotte has become increasingly distressed about your departure and the circumstances surrounding it. Despite our best efforts to provide appropriate explanations, she has continued to ask questions that we cannot answer without revealing information that could be damaging to the crown." Morrison felt his heart clench as he imagined Charlotte struggling with unanswered questions and the sudden absence of someone she had trusted completely. He had hoped that time would help her adjust to his absence, but apparently his departure had created wounds that refused to heal. "What exactly has she said?" Morrison asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand how his decision to leave quietly had affected the child he had been trying to protect. "She has repeatedly stated that she no longer trusts palace staff to tell her the truth, and she has expressed a desire to find Captain Morrison and ask him to explain what really happened," Sir Edward explained. "More concerning, she has begun refusing to cooperate with her new protection officers, claiming that anyone could be taken away without warning, so there's no point in forming attachments." Morrison closed his eyes, understanding that his well-intentioned departure had taught Charlotte exactly the wrong lesson about trust and reliability. Instead of protecting her from pain, He had inadvertently shown her that the people she cared about most could disappear without explanation or recourse. Yesterday, she announced to her parents that she wants to give up her royal title and live as a private citizen when she comes of age, Sir Edward continued. She said she doesn't want to be part of an institution where good people can be forced to leave because of complicated problems from before she was born. The words hit Morrison like physical blows. Charlotte had clearly understood more about his departure than anyone had realized, and she had drawn conclusions that threatened her entire future within the royal family. Her decision to renounce her titles wasn't just a child's tantrum. It was a principled stand against what she perceived as institutional injustice. Sir Edward, what exactly are you asking me to do? Morrison said, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The royal family would like you to consider returning to London for a private meeting with Princess Charlotte. They believe that only you can convince her that her perception of events has been incorrect and that her future lies with the monarchy, not outside it, Sir Edward explained. Morrison laughed bitterly at the irony of the situation. The palace that had forced him to resign because of family connections was now asking him to return and repair the damage his departure had caused. They wanted him to lie to Charlotte about the reasons for his resignation and somehow convince her to embrace the very institution that had treated him unjustly. You want me to manipulate a child into accepting a false version of reality so that she'll continue to serve a system that has already demonstrated its willingness to sacrifice individuals for institutional preservation, Morrison said, his anger finally breaking through the careful control he had maintained for months. Sir Edward had the grace to look uncomfortable as he processed Morrison's accusation. Captain Morrison, I understand your bitterness, but Princess Charlotte's future is at stake. If she follows through on her intention to renounce her titles, it will create a constitutional crisis that could damage the monarchy for generations. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stark beauty of the highland landscape that had become his refuge. In the distance, snow-capped mountains rose against a gray sky, their permanence a sharp contrast to the human dramas that seemed so important but were ultimately temporary. What about my grandmother's diary? Morrison asked, turning back to face Sir Edward. Are you prepared to acknowledge what really happened to Margaret Sinclair? Or do you expect me to perpetuate the lies that have protected palace reputations for 70 years? Sir Edward's face went pale, confirming that the palace was aware of the diary's existence and concerned about its potential contents. Captain Morrison, surely you understand that revealing such historical information would serve no constructive purpose. The people involved are long dead, and exposing their personal failings would only cause pain to their descendants. Morrison realized that he was being offered a choice between personal vindication and Charlotte's future happiness. The palace was betting that his love for the young princess would override his desire for justice for his family's treatment. They were probably right, but Morrison wasn't ready to make that concession without extracting a price. If I agree to meet with Princess Charlotte and help repair the damage caused by my departure, I want something in return, Morrison said, sitting back down across from Sir Edward. What did you have in mind? Sir Edward asked carefully. I want a full official acknowledgement of my grandmother's service to the crown, including her dismissal and the financial arrangements that followed. I want Harold Pemberton's actions investigated and documented, even if the findings remain classified. And I want a formal apology from the palace for the way my family has been treated, Morrison stated. The palace would provide a confidential but official acknowledgement of Margaret Sinclair's treatment and Harold Pemberton's abuse of power. The financial arrangements would be documented as reparations rather than hush money, and Morrison's family name would be cleared of any suggestion of impropriety. In return, Morrison would meet with Princess Charlotte and help her understand that her future lay with the monarchy, not in exile from it. 3 days later, Morrison found himself back at Kensington Palace for the first time since his resignation. The building looked exactly the same, but his relationship to it had changed fundamentally. He was no longer an employee protecting a principal. He was a private citizen with his own agenda and his own secrets to protect. Charlotte was waiting for him in the same sitting room where they had shared countless conversations about everything from elephant memories to castle construction. She looked older than her 8 years, and Morrison could see a new wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there during their previous time together. Hello, Princess Charlotte, Morrison said, unsure whether to maintain the formal address or return to the more personal relationship they had shared. Captain Morrison, she replied, studying his face with an intensity that reminded him of her great-grandmother's legendary ability to read people's true intentions. I have questions for you. Morrison smiled, recognizing that this conversation would be conducted on Charlotte's terms, not according to any script the palace might have preferred. I imagine you do. I have some things I'd like to tell you as well. For the next 2 hours, they talked honestly about duty, sacrifice, family loyalty, and the sometimes painful compromises that came with serving something larger than oneself. Morrison told Charlotte about his grandmother's story, appropriately edited for her age, and explained how sometimes people had to make difficult choices to protect the people they loved. By the end of their conversation, Charlotte had decided to reconsider her renunciation of her royal titles, understanding that running away from problems was less courageous than working to fix them from within. She also extracted a promise from Morrison that he would visit her regularly, a condition the palace readily accepted given the alternative of losing her entirely. As Morrison prepared to leave London and return to his Highland retreat, he reflected on the strange justice of the situation. His grandmother's secrets had ultimately given him the power to protect Charlotte in a way that his position as her bodyguard never could. Sometimes the truth, carefully deployed, was a more effective weapon than any physical force. The royal scandal that had threatened to destroy both Morrison's career and Charlotte's faith in the monarchy had ultimately strengthened both of them, teaching valuable lessons about resilience, integrity, and the courage required to confront uncomfortable truths while still choosing to serve a greater good.